Welcome to Level 7 Ministry in Practice. This first week, we're looking at an introduction to the virtues and vices. As you think of the leadership qualities that you want to embody, as you ponder how you want to actually practice ministry, we want to explore in this course how the virtues and vices connect to our beliefs, our behaviours in a balanced and measured way, where we can prescriptively identify patterns and practices that shape our ministry formation. So we'll be looking at this book, Rebecca Conondike de Young's Glittering Vices, as a lens through which to adjudicate our ministry practices. And this isn't to drag you down into a place where you're mulling over the vices and into a place of blame and shame, but rather it's in order to see how by God's grace we might continue to be sanctified, to be made new with the help of God's grace, how we might live the fullness of life that Jesus Christ has offered to us. Conondike quotes N.T. Wright, who says that often there are two groups of Christians: those in contemporary society who never talk about sin at all, and then they avoid mentioning the word, and then there's others who are entirely fixated on sin and in a very addictive way so that they cannot be set free. So hopefully by studying the virtues and vices, this should help you see patterns in your own leadership and in the ministry context that you're involved in, and allow these patterns to be brought to the foot of cross and sanctified. And hopefully you'll learn that many of the challenges we face today are nothing new. For example, John Cassian, one of the early church fathers and the desert fathers, who systemized the vices after Evagrius. He talked about the danger of a leadership that's lacking in humility. He would caution the monks who wanted to go off and establish their own monasteries, because he saw this action as the epitome of pride and undermining one of the chief goals of the ascetic life, which is the cultivation of humility. He understood humility as this ability to trust in the judgment of others, particularly superiors, rather than enter into solo enterprise. And I feel that quote in itself is very pertinent for today. But let's look at where the vices and virtues came from. Conondike de Young notes that the number of vices, in contrast to the virtues, has fluctuated over time. For virtues, there are the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love, and the four cardinal virtues from philosophical ethics: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. They've been collapsed together under the works of people like Augustine, who directed the enterprise of the virtues away from self-help and really towards how can we live out the fullness of grace that God has offered to us, and he rooted it in grace. But the first notable theologian who looked at vices was Evagrius of Pontus, 346 to 399 AD, one of the Desert Fathers. And you can see how his own context shaped his ministry, being in the desert, refusing to engage in the worldly attributes of success and achievement. He moved towards the ascetic lifestyle, and he had 8 vices. You can see them there, from gluttony right through to pride. And then this was picked up by John Cassian, who formulated these vices into the Western Church and systemized them alongside the 10 signs of humility. Cassian defined humility as the mother of all virtues and the surest foundation of the whole spiritual superstructure. And he believed that to overcome the vice of pride, the corresponding virtue of humility needed to be employed. And Cassian talked about the 10 signs of humility, influenced heavily by the monastic tradition that he was immersed in. Things like not only the instruction of elders, but believing in one's own inferiority to the depths of one's heart. And then some more interesting ones, not just putting to death desires, but things like don't laugh and hold your tongue. So you can see how it's embedded in his monastic context. During that time of Evagrius and Cassian, you can see the vices becoming more clearly defined as well. Out of these 8 vices, 2 were taken away, fame, glory, and pride, and they were separated out because the other 6 were seen to have the potential to be derailed because of vain glory and pride. And it makes sense, doesn't it, when you think you're making strides in your Christian life, slipping away from gluttony and impurity, you can get proud about it and feel you've achieved something. And it's very easy to slip back even into vainglory where you're boasting about your spiritual practices and formation. After Cassian was Benedict's rule in the 6th century, continuing to develop virtues and vices. He extended Cassian's 10 signs of humility into 12 steps of humility, and he added fear of God as the first step, as a means of continually reorienting an awareness towards God. And both Benedict and Cassian really grounded their virtues in the person of Christ. After that, Pope Gregory the First, he was in 540 to 604 AD, adjusted the vices slightly, collapsed sloth and sadness together, made envy a member, but put pride down at the root. He saw pride as this queen of sins and opening the heart to the other vices. And so as we move through into the medieval period, we begin to see a pattern developing where you have humility on the one side and pride on the other side as these grounding root virtues. In contrast to the vice of pride, you have humility as a root. And this was taken up by various artists in the 12th century. You can see the Speculum Virginum of the 12th century here, attributed to Conrad of Herceau, and it depicts 2 trees on facing pages called the Tree of Virtue and the Tree of Vice. The Tree of Vice has pride as its root, whereas the Tree of Virtue has humility. And for those that bore fruits of vice, the root was attributed to pride, whereas those bearing virtuous fruits had humility as their root. And the image of the tree is very fitting, I think, for this work, because if you want to deal with the vices, you can't just cut off the branches or the fruits. You really need to get down to the root. Cassian used that metaphor a lot in his work, the tree, as well, and talking about getting down to the roots, getting down to the channels of the water that were feeding the roots as well. As we move on to the 12th century, we come across Bernard de Clairvaux, who had similar comparisons between pride and humility. He comments on Benedict's 12 signs to demonstrate that through humility comes self-knowledge leading towards Christ, the perfect model of humility, and the downward steps of pride are contrasted with the upward steps of humility. Some attributes that he used to describe humility were congruence between one's inside and one's outside, silence, restraint in speech, a lucid self-awareness, emotional sobriety, as well as disclosure of the heart. So very deeply descriptive in terms of what humility is. Bernard de Clairvaux locates pride. It's an interesting description in a misappropriation of curiosity. And that might seem counterintuitive, especially when humility is supposed to open us to being open to others, open to learning, open to growing. But for Bernard, curiosity followed closely after Augustine's curiositas, which is connected with this undue interest in other people's lives and this fascination with the spectacular. By the time we reach Aquinas, then he really was the master of systematic thinking, and he put together theology with philosophy. And there's a large section in his Summa Theologica on the virtues and the vices. So it was well defined and well systematized by the time we reach Aquinas. And then to scupper it all, along comes the Reformation, and the system began to unravel then during the Reformation and later on with the developments of the Enlightenment. The scholastics found the program that Aquinas has set up very unsystematic, and they cut away from it. But the reformers, by contrast, they had a really deep-seated suspicion to the virtues for a number of reasons. McCaskill comments how Luther famously considered the pursuit of humility dangerous because it involved the risk of self-deception about one's true arrogance. Luther also believed that the virtues overemphasized and diminished. Luther believed that an overemphasis on virtue diminished the nature of sin and heightened the need of a savior. The Enlightenment swiftly followed the Reformation, further fragmenting virtues in ways that became very difficult to repair in Protestant theology. But it would be disingenuous to say that the faults were one-sided, because there was radicalization on both sides of theology. For Aquinas, theologies of virtue were constructed around the belief in a pervasive good, whereas for Luther, theologies of virtue were deconstructed around belief in pervasive evil. Another noteworthy feature in the Reformation is this issue around passivity, a devotion to passivity, believing that believers are simply receptors and objects of alien grace, and not reciprocal partners or participants in it. And so there was this deep suspicion of works righteousness, hence the passivity and reliance on the solas, justification by faith alone, by grace alone, by faith alone, through grace alone. And for all these reasons, Stanley Harhouse and theologians following in his wake have been motivated to construct their own accounts of character and morality, noting that particularly within Protestant theology, there's a shift from character orientation towards command. In other words, there's a shift from a moral account centered on the character of the agent to the one centered on the justification of a given act or practice. In the secular sphere, a similar enterprise was working as well. Alistair MacIntyre, in his book After Virtue, notes that during the Enlightenment there was a fragmentation of virtues. Prior to modernity, virtues were located firmly in society and in a teleology that moved from disorder to order, but now the atomization of self severed all of this. However, in recent decades, there's been a resurgence of thinking through thinkers like Willard, Richard Foster, James K. Smith, returning to spiritual formation, but always in the context of grace. And added to Bonhoeffer's idea of cheap grace, it raises questions in our society about the Christian's relationship to challenges like growing Christian nationalism, white supremacy, racism, climate change, to name a few. So just very briefly, what are the vices? Why do we call them such? Conondike says they're not just bad habits or most frequent sins, but capital vices emerging from that Latin word caput, meaning the source and fountainhead. Conondike prefers the term vices rather than sins because it specifically identifies ingrained patterns of behaviour. But I think in closing, I just want to alert you to this idea that the vices promise much. That's why they're attractive to so many people. They promise happiness, they promise human fulfillment, and yet ultimately they twist and distort all these things and offer cheap shortcuts to contentment. They're not designed for eternity, but simply replace infinite fulfillment with something that's transient. So it's important to excavate the power behind devices and what they claim to do so that we can offer alternatives to fullness of life. So this is an opportunity to hold a mirror up to yourself, a mirror up to society as well, and identify unhealthy patterns and, like Cassian, find that heavenly medicine.